Chapter 9 of That Affair at Elizabeth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That Affair at Elizabeth by Burton E. Stevenson. Chapter 9. The Old Sorrow. To Mrs. Lawrence? I repeated. Here was a coincidence indeed. Could it be, I asked myself again, that this thing had been deliberately arranged? But I dismissed the thought as ridiculous. "I will tell you the story so far I know it," said the clergyman. "It is no breach of trust to do so, for it was public property at the time, though long since forgotten. I should not recall it now but for the fact that it may shed some light upon to day's occurrence." "Perhaps it will," I agreed. "Mrs. Lawrence," began my companion, "was born at Scotch Plains about 50 years ago. Her father's name was Hiram Jarvis. He had made a comfortable fortune in the dry goods business in New York, and had built himself a country house at Scotch Plains, going into New York every morning and returning every evening. Scotch Plains is a very small place, a mere village, but has a number of handsome country houses. It is not on the railroad, but lies about a mile back of Fanwood, which is its station. It has a little Presbyterian church, and when I graduated in '65 from Princeton Seminary, I received a call to it, which I accepted. Mr. Jarvis and his daughter were members of my congregation, the former, indeed, being the president of the board of trustees." I nodded my interest. Plainly I had done well in coming to Dr. Schuyler. "Jarvis was a tall, straight, austere Scotchman of the old school," continued the clergyman, "with a belief in predestination and eternal punishment which was, well, rather fanatical, even for those days. His daughter was a beautiful girl of 17 or 18. Her mother had died some years before, and she was left solely in her father's care, without brothers or sisters. There was an aunt in New York City, a younger sister of her father, and married to a banker named Hemenway, but she seemingly took little interest in the girl. Her character, or so I judged the few times I saw her, was much like her brother's, tempered perhaps with a little more worldliness. I think she's still living, at least I've never heard of her death. She has been a widow for many years. So the girl grew up in the lonely house, with only her father to care for. I sometimes thought his treatment of her a little severe. He would rarely permit her to take part in even the most innocent merrymaking, and I often found myself pitying her. But I concluded it was none of my business. A conclusion which was cowardly, perhaps, but that was my first charge, and Jarvis was quite a terrifying man." I could well believe it, and said so. "There was another member of my congregation," went on Dr. Schuyler, "concerning whom I had doubts of quite an opposite character. That was young Boyd Endicott. The Endicott place lay just beyond the Jarvis house, which it quite overshadowed, for the Endicotts were very wealthy. The father did not belong to my church, nor indeed to any church, and I seldom met him. He had been associated with Jim Fisk in some operations which seemed to me of questionable honesty, though Fisk's reputation may have prejudiced me unduly. But his wife was a lovely Christian woman, and devoted to her children." "Her children?" I repeated. The story interested me so intensely that I wanted every detail. "There were two, a girl of 17 or 18 named Ruth, and Boyd, who was about 19 and a junior at Princeton. I had heard something of his college escapades while I was at the seminary, but the first time I saw him was when he came home for the holidays. He was a handsome boy, dark, with a face that showed his breeding, but he was the wildest, most untamable I ever knew. When he came walking into church with his mother, it used to amuse me to see how Mr. Jarvis would glare at him. He considered him a firebrand of hell, and didn't scruple to say so. And young Endicott would stare back at Jarvis, as I thought, but I saw my mistake afterwards. There was more or less trouble of a personal kind between the two. Endicott's dog killed some of the Jarvis chickens, and Jarvis shot the dog. Endicott rode over the Jarvis land, and Jarvis swore out a warrant against him for trespass. Mere persecution, the villagers thought it, and there were other differences of a similar nature, which were ended only when the boy went back to school. Of course, Mr. Lester, I don't know all the steps in the affair, but on Christmas Eve, just a year later, there came a great knocking at my door, and when I opened it, there on the step stood Jarvis, with such a face as I had never seen on a man before. He stamped in and flung a sheet of paper down on the table. "Read that," he said in a stifled voice. "Read that, man. Oh, that I should have bred a harlot!" I was too astonished to reply, but I picked up the paper and read it. It was a note from his daughter. I forget the exact words, but she told him that she had secretly married Boyd Endicott, knowing that she could never win his consent, and prayed for his forgiveness. They were going far away, she said. She would not see him again for a long time, and hoped he would think kindly of her. It was a touching note, Mr. Lester. The good man's voice choked, and he paused to regain control of it. As for me, I thought of that other note I had read a few hours since. "He was like a man crazed," continued Dr. Schuyler at last. "He wouldn't listen to reason. He demanded only that I accompany him while he sought his daughter out and made sure that she and young Endicott were really married. He swore that he would follow them to the ends of the earth that he might see them wedded with his own eyes." A heavy storm was raging, but I could not deny him. He had his buggy at the door, and we drove away to the Fanwood station. There the agent told us that Miss Jarvis had taken the afternoon train for New York. There was no other train for an hour, so we waited. Jarvis tramped up and down the station like a wild thing. And then, just before the train was due, there came a telegram for him. It was from his sister, and stated that Mary had reached her home unattended and was very ill. That settled the matter so far as I was concerned. I drove back home again, and Jarvis went on to New York. Unfortunately, in the first rage of his discovery of his daughter's flight, he had given the servants some hint of the affair, and it leaked out, but was gradually forgotten. Mary Jarvis, after a long illness, went with her father for a visit to Scotland, and did not return to her home at Scotch Plains for nearly 3 years. She was greatly changed, older, and with an air of sadness which never quite left her. Her father was changed, too. He had left his daughter at his old home in Scotland and hurried back. Why, I didn't guess till afterwards. He became more crabbed and irritable than ever. He seemed to be withering away, and his face grew to haunt me, it was so harried and anxious. I suspected that he had become involved in business troubles of some sort, for the country was on the verge of a panic, and once I tried to approach the subject, to offer any help I could, but he stopped me with such ferocity that I never tried again. Then suddenly came the news that Endicott had been caught with Fisk in the ruin of Black Friday. But while Fisk saved himself by repudiating his obligations, Endicott had been bound in such a way that he could not repudiate, and the man who had bound him was Hiram Jarvis. The speaker paused and leaned back for a moment in his chair, his face very stern. "That was his revenge," he added, "but I doubt if he foresaw how bitter it was to be. For Endicott shot himself. The place was sold, and the widow and her daughter came to live here in Elizabeth, where they had relatives." "But the boy?" I asked. "Where was he?" "He was killed 2 days after that Christmas Eve in a railroad wreck somewhere in the West. I have forgotten exactly where. His body was brought home to Scotch Plains and buried there." "In the West?" I repeated. "What was he doing in the West?" "I don't know," answered Dr. Schuyler. "I've never been able to understand it." "Were he and Miss Jarvis already married, or did they expect to be married afterwards?" "Well," said Dr. Schuyler slowly, "I inferred from the note that they were already married, but I may have been mistaken in thinking so. I know that her father did not believe it." "And you say that you've never been able to understand why, after all, they did not go away together. Why Miss Jarvis went to New York and Endicott to the West?" Dr. Schuyler hesitated. "Of course," he said after a moment, "the most obvious explanation is that Endicott deserted her. and yet that would have been so unlike him, for he was not a vicious or selfish fellow, Mr. Lester, but generous, honorable, warm-hearted, despite his other faults, which were merely, I think, faults of youth. I've never believed that he deserted her. Perhaps at the last moment her courage failed, or perhaps there was a mistake of some sort, a misunderstanding which kept them apart. I pondered it for a moment, then put it aside. That was not the mystery I had set myself to solve. "Well, Miss Jarvis evidently got over it," I remarked, "since she afterwards became Mrs. Lawrence." "That is one way of looking at it," he assented. "But I've always thought that she was so far from getting over it that she never greatly cared what became of her afterwards." "Was it so bad as that?" "It was as bad as it could possibly be. She did not return from Scotland for 2 years and more. It was about a year later that she married Lawrence, who was a business associate of her father and lived here at Elizabeth. I had been called to the pastorate of the church here, and performed the ceremony." "Lawrence must have been considerably older than she, then," I suggested. "Oh, much older. He was a widower without children. I always fancied that her father had arranged the match. He had completely broken down, and knew he hadn't long to live." "And there was only one child of this marriage?" "Only one, Marcia." "How long has Mrs. Lawrence been a widow?" "Oh, for 20 years and more." "She has lived here ever since?" "She has kept her home here, but she was abroad with her daughter for a long time, 6 or 7 years at least. She was very fond of France. And so was Marcia, perhaps because she was born there." "Born there?" I repeated, in some surprise. "Yes. Mr. Lawrence had a very severe illness a few months after his marriage. I don't remember just what it was, and his doctor ordered him to the south of France for a long rest. His wife, of course, accompanied him, and Marcia was born there. I think that is all the story, Mr. Lester." "Not quite all," I said. "There is still a loose end. What became of Mrs. Endicott and her daughter? I think you said there was a daughter?" "Yes, Ruth. One of the loveliest girls I ever knew. They came here from Scotch Plains, as I've said, to make their home with Mrs. Endicott's sister, Mrs. Kingdon." He noticed my start of astonishment, and paused to look at me inquiringly. "I beg your pardon," I said, "but the name struck me. Miss Lawrence's maid is named Kingdon." "Yes, she's a niece of Mrs. Endicott. I've sometimes thought that it was because of this relationship that Mrs. Lawrence was so kind to her and her sister." "Kind to them?" I repeated. "In what way?" "She gave them the cottage they live in," he explained, "and has helped them in many other ways. The younger girl, Lucy, has a place in her household, where her duties, I fancy, are purely nominal. Her sister is supposed to take in sewing, but she really does very little." "And they are Mrs. Endicott's nieces?" "Yes, her sister's children." "And Boyd Endicott's cousins?" "Precisely." I felt a little glow of excitement, for here was a clue which might lead me out of the labyrinth, a loose end which, grasped firmly, might serve to unravel this tangled skein. "Please go on," I said. "You have not yet told me what became of Mrs. Endicott and her daughter." "They made their home with Mrs. Kingdon, who was also a widow. Mrs. Kingdon had had much trouble. Her husband had died in an asylum for the insane, and they had a hard time to get along. But Mrs. Endicott died within a year." "And Ruth?" I questioned. "Ruth was a lovely girl. I shall never forget her, with the same dark, passionate beauty her brother had. She possessed artistic talent which seemed to me of an unusual order, and she fancied that she could make a living by painting portraits. But she soon found that there was no market for her work here in Elizabeth, and that she needed years of training before she could hope to be successful elsewhere. So she was forced to give it up." "And then?" I prompted, for I saw by his hesitation that there was still something coming, and I was determined to have the whole story. "I have already told you that Mr. Lawrence was a widower. His first wife was an invalid for a long time before her death, and when Ruth Endicott found she could not make a living with her brush, she accepted the position of companion to Mrs. Lawrence. I do not fancy the place was a pleasant one, but she kept it until Mrs. Lawrence's death." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for an instant in an effort to straighten out this story, which was always turning back upon itself. What mystery was there, what mystery could there be, in the lives of the Kingdons and the Lawrences and the Endicotts, which had led up to the tragedy for which I was seeking an explanation? "Well, and after that?" I asked, giving it up with a sigh of despair and turning back to the clergyman. "There isn't much more to tell. After Mrs. Lawrence's death, Ruth Endicott remained for a time as Lawrence's housekeeper. But she had overworked herself, she seemed the very embodiment of health, and taxed her strength too heavily. She broke down very suddenly, and died, if I remember rightly, in Florida, where the elder Kingdon girl had taken her. She was the last of the Endicotts." The last of the Endicotts, the last of the Endicotts. I repeated the words over and over to myself. It may have been a presentiment or merely an idle fancy, but something whispered in my ear, some impalpable presence warned me that I had not yet heard the last of her. Ruth Endicott. There was something in the name, a melody, the vision it evoked of a dark and brilliantly beautiful woman, which haunted me. And yet what possible connection could she have with the mystery which I had started to investigate? 30 years dead, how could any fact connected with her drive Marcia Lawrence forth into hiding at the hour of her wedding? The utter absurdity of the thought was so apparent that I put it impatiently from me. "You knew Mr. Lawrence, of course?" I asked at last. "Oh, yes," and he hitched uneasily in his chair as though approaching an unwelcome topic. "But I did not know him well. He was what the world calls a hard man, somewhat harsh and cold, though perfectly free from positive vice. He was thoroughly respected. He seems to have left a large property." "Yes, one of the largest in Elizabeth. Mrs. Lawrence, of course, inherited her father's also." "Both she and her daughter are members of your church?" "Two of the most faithful. They give largely to charity. They are really Christian women." We sat silent for a moment. To me, at least, the mystery seemed deeper than ever. "Has it occurred to you, Mr. Lester," asked the clergyman hesitatingly, "that perhaps Miss Lawrence discovered something in Mr. Curtiss's past?" "Yes," I interrupted. "I put that before Curtiss squarely, and he assured me there was nothing she could discover. I'm sure he spoke the truth. Besides, in that case, why should Miss Lawrence flee? Why not merely dismiss him? Her flight seems to argue some guilt on her part." "Yes," nodded my companion, "yes." "Some guilt, too," I added, "of a very remarkable kind, which she was not conscious of until this morning, and which then appeared suddenly before her in such hideous shape that flight was her only resource. That seems inconceivable, doesn't it?" Dr. Schuyler dropped his head back against his chair with a little sigh which bespoke utter fatigue. "Yes," he said, "inconceivable. The whole thing is inconceivable. It's a kind of horrible nightmare. I can't make anything of it. My brain is in a whirl." "I'm taxing your patience too long," I protested, rising instantly. "You need rest. Only let me thank you for your kindness." He held out his hand with a smile. "I seem only to have made dark places darker," he said. "If you succeed in untangling the snarl, I should like to hear about it." "You shall," I promised, and took myself back to the hotel. I felt that there was nothing more to be done that night, and so mounted to my room. As I started to undress, I remembered suddenly the envelope Curtiss had sent me. I got it out and opened it, and my heart leaped with a sudden suffocating sympathy as I looked at the photograph within. A Madonna, indeed! Mr. Royce had chosen the right word, had paid a fitting tribute not only to her beauty, but to the spotless soul behind it. For the face was essentially girlish, virginal. There was no shameful secret back of that clear, direct gaze. It was sweet, frank, winning; a strong face, too, showing intellect and training. No ordinary woman, I told myself; not one certainly to be swayed by momentary passion, to yield to an unreasoning impulse. No, nor one to fall victim to an adventurer, for this was a woman with ideals, and high ones, a woman whose clear eyes could detect any specious imposture at a glance. A fitting mate for Burr Curtiss, the appointed mate, and yet not his, not his, snatched from him by a desperate act. Desperate! If I, a man hardened by contact with the world, could feel that, how much more poignantly must she have felt it; with what horror must she have shrunk from it; with what agony yielded. As I gazed at her, it seemed to me that there was something familiar in the face, in the set of the eyes, the shape of the forehead; something familiar in the expression, in the poise of the head, which puzzled and eluded me. A resemblance to her mother, I decided at last, and so put the photograph away and went to bed. But sleep did not come easily. Ever before my eyes there danced a vision of that vine embowered cottage opening from the Lawrence grounds. There, I felt, lay the key to the mystery. It was to it I must turn for the clue which would lead me out of this labyrinth. There was some secret about these Kingdon sisters which defied and worried me. Dr. Schuyler's explanation of their connection with Mrs. Lawrence did not in the least satisfy me. That she should keep them near her, shower them with gifts, merely because of an old fondness for a cousin of theirs, seemed to me exceedingly improbable. There must be some other reason, some more compelling one than that. It was much more likely, I told myself, remembering the passionate fierceness of the younger sister, that the gifts were intended to placate, not to reward; that they were the outgrowth of fear, not of affection. Fear of what, I could not even guess; fear of the exposure of some secret, perhaps, and the thought stung me to a sudden attention. Had the gifts been in vain? Had the secret been exposed? Was it they who had whispered in Marcia Lawrence's ear the story which had broken the marriage, caused her flight, ruined her future? Was that their revenge for some old injury? Had they waited till the last moment to make it more complete, more crushing? But if they indeed had so avenged themselves, would she have fled to them for refuge? Would she not rather have fled from them with loathing? I felt that I was entangling myself in a web of my own weaving. I put the problem from me, but it pursued me even past sleep's portals. I dreamed I was staring over the hedge at the Kingdon cottage, at a lighted window. 3 women were in the room, as I could see from the shadows thrown upon the blind. They were walking up and down, seemingly in great excitement. I fancied that I could hear the sound of voices, but I could distinguish no words. Then suddenly 2 of the women sprang upon the third. She struggled desperately, but their hands were at her throat, choking her life away. She turned toward me, the curtain seemed to lift, and I beheld the agonized face of Marcia Lawrence. I tried to leap the hedge, but could not stir. Some power beyond me seemed to hold me fast; some mighty weight bound me to the spot. A moment longer the struggle lasted, while I stood staring. I felt her eyes on mine; I knew that she had seen me. She held out an imploring hand; then, when I made no sign in answer, despair swept across her face. She seemed to realize her helplessness, and collapsed into the arms of her assailants with a scream so shrill, so terrible, that it startled me awake. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of That Affair at Elizabeth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That Affair at Elizabeth by Burton E. Stevenson. Chapter 10 The Mysterious Light. It was some moments before I could think clearly, so real and vivid had that vision been. I threw out my arms to assure myself that I was still in bed. I could scarcely believe that I was not really shivering behind the hedge, staring across at that lighted window and the dreadful drama it revealed. I was bathed in perspiration, and yet felt chilled to the very marrow. Indeed, my teeth were chattering as I groped my way to the light, turned it on, and looked at my watch. It was nearly 1 o'clock. The night was clear and pleasant, with a faint breeze stirring. There was no moon, but the stars were shining so brightly that one looked for it instinctively. I knew it was no use to return to bed until my nerves were quieter, and indeed that vision had banished all desire for sleep. So I filled my pipe, lighted it, drew up a chair, and sat down by the open window. The street below was deserted, and for an instant I found myself wondering that it was not thronged with people, roused by the scream which had awakened me. Then I remembered that there had been no scream, that I had simply dreamed it. But I had only to close my eyes to see again that lighted window and the shadows on the blind. It seemed even clearer to me than it had been in the dream. I could see every detail of the struggle, and I opened my eyes abruptly so that I might escape the end. There was something supernatural about it. I had never dreamed a dream like it before, a dream which, waking, I could rehearse at pleasure. Perhaps it was not wholly a vision. Perhaps it had some foundation in reality, some telepathic origin. I had read of such things, skeptically, but some of the phenomena of thought transference had, I knew, been accepted, reluctantly enough, even by the scientific world. Was it not possible that Marcia Lawrence had been lured to the Kingdon cottage or taken there against her will? Who could say how that old injury done the Endicotts would flower and fruit? Who could say what hatred, what desire for vengeance, rankled in the hearts of the Kingdons? I remembered how the face of the maid had darkened with malice, how her eyes had blazed with infernal joy as she stood there in the door of the library, thinking herself unseen. Her sister I knew nothing of, but if they resembled each other, as sisters usually do, I could well believe them capable of any cruelty. Was it not possible that Marcia Lawrence was in their hands? Was it not possible that my dream possessed a basis of reality? I had been thinking of her all the evening. I had gone to sleep with the problem of her disappearance still on my mind. I had been studying her photograph. I was, in a word, in spiritual touch with her, responsive to any suggestion emanating from her. We were tuned to the same pitch. Such, I fancied, was the explanation of the phenomena which a telepathist would give. She had sent that cry into the night, and I, being en rapport with her, had heard it, had witnessed the tragedy which it called forth. Perhaps the struggle was not yet ended, perhaps even at this moment. I sprang to my feet, hurried into my clothes, caught up my hat, opened my door, and ran noiselessly down the stair. I would solve this problem to night if it could be solved. I had been wrong in turning away from the Kingdon cottage the evening before. I should at least have made an effort to discover if Marcia Lawrence were really there. But it had not occurred to me then that she could be in any danger. I had thought too much of what Curtiss would wish me to do, too little of what the necessities of the case required. Well, I would not make that mistake a second time. As I look back upon my frame of mind at that moment, and consider the impulse which sent me forth from my room at that hour of the night, I realize how overwrought I was. At a distance, in cold blood, it seems an absurd thing to have done. Yet, under the same conditions, I should no doubt behave again in much the same way. And even admitting its absurdity, I am not prepared to say, in view of the event, that there was not back of it some instinct worth following. There are forces in nature not yet explained or recognized, and I am still inclined to think that it was one of these which drew me forth upon that midnight errand. In a very fever of impatience I hurried along the street, under the trees, meeting no one except a patrolman. I heard him stop as I passed him, and knew that he was looking back after me, but I kept on without pausing, and heard him finally start on again. In a minute more I reached the Lawrence place, and stopped in the shadow of a tree for a look around. The house loomed through the darkness, grim and gloomy, with no light showing anywhere. I leaped the fence, assured that I was unseen, and pushed my way forward through the grove toward the path which led to the cottage. Beneath the trees the darkness was absolute, and I could go forward but slowly. Yet, starting from the library steps, I found the path without difficulty, and felt my way cautiously along it until I came to the hedge which marked the limits of the Kingdon place. I examined the house with care, but there was fronting me no lighted window upon which a tragedy could be pictured. Indeed, I saw no vestige of a light, and was about to conclude that my midnight pilgrimage had been in vain, when my eye was caught by a faint glimmer near the ground. At first I was not sure it was a light at all. Then I decided that it was a reflection of some sort, or perhaps a phosphorescent glow. But as I stared at it with eyes contracted, it suddenly took shape in the darkness, and I saw that the light proceeded from a small ventilator set in the foundation of the house. Trembling with excitement, I softly opened the gate and entered the grounds. Here, with nothing between me and the stars, I suddenly found myself in what seemed a veritable blaze of light. I was seized with panic lest I be seen, and scurried into the shadow of the house, then dropped beside the ventilator and examined it. It was of the ordinary type, a plate of iron some 6 or 8 inches square, perforated with holes perhaps half an inch in diameter, and set in the foundation about 6 inches from the ground. I applied an eye to one of the holes and endeavored to see what lay beyond. For a moment I saw absolutely nothing. Then I perceived in front of me a stretch of clay which ended abruptly at a distance of 6 or 8 feet. A few inches above the level of my eye were the beams supporting the floor of the cottage, but it was only a glance I gave to these details, though I found them afterwards photographed upon my brain. It was the space beyond which fixed my attention, the space where the clay bank before me dropped abruptly to what was no doubt the cellar of the cottage. It was from this space that the light proceeded, but of what lay within it I could see almost nothing, only enough indeed to fire my curiosity. For from time to time a shadow moved between me and the light, a shadow which showed that the cellar was not empty. The light, I judged, had been placed on a stool or table on the opposite side of the cellar. From the way it varied, now bright, now dim, I decided it was a candle, and that the motions of the person working near it caused the flame to flicker. These motions would continue for a time with considerable regularity, then they would cease while the worker evidently stopped to rest, and then begin again. Who was this person, and what was this work which must be done at such an hour? In vain I sought an answer. I pressed my ear to the ventilator, but could hear nothing, nothing at least beyond the faintest of faint sounds, which gave me no clue to what was happening within. I peered through the little orifice moment after moment, until the shadows grew confused and blurred, and my eyes ached under the strain. I rose to rest myself. Then it suddenly occurred to me that the cellar must have a window. Skirting the house cautiously, I at last came to it, but it was closed and curtained so effectually that only a faint glimmer here and there betrayed the light within. I listened, but could hear no sound. Fairly nonplussed, I returned to the hedge and sat down against it to consider. The shadow had given me no indication of whether the worker was a man or woman, yet to the first question I had asked myself there could be only one answer. It was one or both of the Kingdon women who were working in the cellar. Both, I finally decided, since it was improbable that one could spend the night there without the knowledge of the other. But what were they doing? To this I could find no answer. It was not merely an errand, because the light remained. Minute after minute I sat there, until I heard a clock somewhere strike 2, and still the light remained. I crept forward to the ventilator and peered through again. The shadows were moving backward and forward, just as they had been an hour before. There was something uncanny about them, and I shivered as I watched. It seemed to me that they were made by some person alternately rising and stooping, but why should any one do that for hours at a time? Some subtle association of ideas brought before my eyes the vision which had confronted Jean Valjean on that night when he had peered through the grated window into the convent of Little Picpus, the dim light, the vast hall, the motionless figure on the floor before the cross. Was some such explanation to be sought here? Were these long-continued risings and stoopings a series of genuflections before some shrine, a penance perhaps imposed for some transgression? The thought seemed absurd, but I could think of no other explanation of these singular motions. At last, weary with long staring, I went back to my seat beside the hedge and waited. Half an hour passed. Then I saw the glimmer at the ventilator suddenly disappear, and a moment later a light gleamed through the kitchen window. It went on toward the front of the house, and I saw the shadow of a woman's figure on the blind as it passed the window in front of me. Only one shadow. There was only one woman in the house, or at least only one awake and moving about. There had been only one in the cellar. My resolution was taken. I went straight forward to the door at the side of the house and knocked sharply. At the same instant the light vanished. I waited a moment, then knocked again more loudly. "Who's there?" called a voice, so harsh, so fierce that it fairly startled me. "Open the door," I said. "I wish to see Miss Lawrence." "This is not Miss Lawrence's home," cried the voice. "I know it, but she's here." "She's not here!" and the voice rose to a scream. "Be off, or I'll fire through the door." What sort of fury was this, I asked myself, and I stepped to one side to be out of range of a possible bullet. "Be off!" screamed the voice again. "I'll fire, I swear it. The law will justify me." There could be no question of that. It would be worse than folly to attempt to force an entrance with this fury opposing me, so I retreated again to the hedge and sat down to see what would happen. But nothing happened, and deciding at last that Miss Kingdon, or whoever it was had answered me, had gone to bed, I turned my steps toward the hotel just as dawn was tingeing the east with gray. And one thing I determined on: I would purchase a revolver. Only a fool ventures unarmed into the tiger's den. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of That Affair at Elizabeth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That Affair at Elizabeth by Burton E. Stevenson. Chapter 11. An Old Acquaintance. I arose betimes in the morning, despite the fact that I had been up most of the night, for I was determined to gain entrance to the Kingdon cottage and force an interview with Marcia Lawrence before I went to my appointment with her mother. Day had taken from my dream nothing of its vividness, but my nerves were normal again, and I could approach the task with a coolness which had not been possible the night before. That Marcia Lawrence had taken refuge with the Kingdons I did not for an instant doubt. It was my business to prove it, to gain entrance to her presence and persuade her to grant Burr Curtiss a final interview. There was another mystery about the cottage which piqued and puzzled me. What was the meaning of that light in the cellar? What work had been going forward there, hour after hour? Whose was that shrill and violent voice which had threatened me through the door? And how had it been possible for the other inmates of the house to sleep on undisturbed through all that commotion? If Miss Lawrence were really there, would she not have heard me? I descended to the dining room, revolving this problem in my mind, so intent upon it that I brushed into a man at the door. I turned to apologize, and saw his face light up at the sight of me. "Why, hello, Lester," he cried, holding out his hand. "This is luck." "Hello, Godfrey," I answered, returning his clasp with interest. "Glad to see you." "Not half so glad as I am to see you. Come over here to this side table where we can talk in peace. Quite like the studio, isn't it?" I laughed responsively at the memory of that night when Jim Godfrey, of the Record, for purposes of his own, had kidnapped me and entertained me with a superb dinner at the famous Sixth Avenue resort. I had met him occasionally since, and had found him always the same genial, generous, astute fellow he had proved himself then. Trained on the detective force, he had been for some years the Record's star reporter, and was employed only on what the newspapers loved to call cause célèbre. Of course I knew instantly what cause it was had brought him to Elizabeth. "Here on business?" he asked, as we sat down. "Yes. And you?" "Oh, I came down last night to write up this Lawrence Curtis affair. You've heard about it?" He was looking at me keenly. "Yes," I answered steadily, determined to keep him from guessing my connection with it. "I read about it in the papers last night. Queer affair, wasn't it?" "Mighty queer. You haven't happened to form a theory about it, have you?" I laughed outright. He had come to me for a theory once before, and here he was at his old trick. "I haven't enough data to form a theory," I said. "Well, maybe I can furnish you with more. I did some pretty lively work last night, and covered all the details I could think of." "I haven't seen this morning's Record," I said. "Of course it's all there." "Not quite all. I don't want to give the other fellows too much rope. They're all tied up in a knot now, and I want them to stay that way." "The other fellows, I suppose, are your esteemed contemporaries?" "In plain English, my hated rivals. But I don't mind telling you. You treated me square in the Holladay case. The boys told me afterwards how you refused to give me away." "All right, fire ahead," I said, and cut my steak. "Well," he began, "I saw at once, after I'd looked over the field and found out that it was impossible to see either Curtis or Mrs. Lawrence, that the persons who could probably tell me most about the inside workings of this affair were the servants in the Lawrence house. Evidently there must have been trouble of some sort there, and it would probably not escape the servants' notice. So I went after them." I nodded, but kept my eyes on my plate. Here was luck indeed. "There are 5 of them," he went on. "An outside man who takes care of the grounds and horses, a cook, 2 house girls, and a maid. The outside man is the husband of the cook. They and the house girls stay at the place, and the maid lives with her sister in a cottage just off the grounds." "And could they tell you anything?" I asked. "Neither the man, the cook, nor the house girls could tell me a thing. They'd all been busy preparing for the wedding, and didn't know anything was wrong until the maid, whose name is Lucy Kingdon, told them Miss Lawrence had disappeared. The house girls had been passing back and forth all the time, and had caught a glimpse of Miss Lawrence now and then, but had noticed absolutely nothing unusual, had seen no stranger about the place, nor heard any outcry. One of them passed Miss Lawrence in the hall as she was talking with the decorator, and says that she was radiant with happiness." "But the maid?" I asked, anxious to hear what he had got from her. "Ah, she was different. She's been with the family a long time. She seems to be a kind of privileged character, a trusted confidant, though why any one should wish to trust her is beyond me. She's not an attractive woman, rather the reverse." "And what did she tell you?" "She didn't tell me anything," answered Godfrey, with some heat. "She beat about the bush and finally got angry. But I'm sure of one thing, and that is that she knows where Miss Lawrence is. Indeed," he added, "I'm pretty certain that Miss Lawrence passed the night in the Kingdon cottage." "Why?" I asked, with lively interest at this confirmation of my own belief. "I don't know, just a sort of intuition. And then they wouldn't let me in to see." "Oh, you tried to get in, did you?" "I certainly did. Tried my level best, but couldn't make it. Those Kingdon sisters are a pair of Tartars. Both of them were there. The elder one was a beauty when she was young, I fancy, but she's seen some trying times since, to judge from her face. She's got mighty handsome eyes even yet, and my, how they can flash! Well, they sent me to the right about as soon as they learned my errand. I tried all my wiles," he added, with a little rueful smile, "and in vain." "But intuition's hardly enough to go on," I suggested. "Of course there's more than that. It's the only house she could have reached without being seen. There's a path leads to it through a grove which screens it from the street. If she'd gone in any other direction, she'd have had to venture out into the open, where somebody would have been sure to see her. Remember, she was in her wedding dress, and there were probably a good many people standing around watching the house, as they always do at these fashionable weddings." Perhaps something in my face betrayed me. At any rate, he looked at me with a sudden intent interest. "See here, Lester," he said, "I believe you're in on this thing yourself." "Not for publication." "Agreed. Now let's have it." "Well," I explained, "I'm working for Curtiss. I'm trying to find Miss Lawrence. He thinks he's entitled to an explanation." Godfrey nodded quickly. "Any man would think so," he said. "How are you going about it?" "I'm going to take advantage of the hint you just gave me." "And go to the Kingdon house?" "Yes. I believe Miss Lawrence is there myself. I thought so last night when I came to it after following that path through the grove." "So you'd discovered it, too? Well, I wish you luck. Of course, we may be all wrong. I don't believe there are any other pointers I can give you," he added, "or I'd be glad to. I suppose you saw Mrs. Lawrence?" "Oh, yes." "How was she affected?" "Not so deeply as you'd expect," I said. He gazed at me with narrowed eyes. "Has it occurred to you, Lester," he said at last, "that Miss Lawrence may not have gone away of her own accord at all? That there may be a plot against her? That she was forced to go, or perhaps even shut up in some room in the Lawrence house?" "Yes, I'd thought of it. I even put it to Mrs. Lawrence." "And what did she say?" "She laughed at me. She said her daughter was a strong girl who wouldn't let herself be abducted without a struggle, and that a single scream would have alarmed the house." "But suppose she'd been drugged?" suggested Godfrey. "Then she would have neither screamed nor struggled." "Last night," I said, "I was half inclined to believe that something of the sort had happened. I'd forgotten one fact which absolutely disproves it. She left a note behind her, or at least wrote it and sent it back after she ran away." "Ah, she did?" "Yes, a note saying the marriage was impossible, though her love was unaltered, and that Curtiss wasn't to attempt to find her." Godfrey sat suddenly upright with grim countenance. "Then there's only one explanation of it," he said. "There's only one thing could make a girl drop everything and run away like that, only one thing in the world. She's already married, and her first husband's turned up." "I'd thought of that, too, but her mother swears her daughter never had a love affair previous to this one." "Of course she'd say so. Has any other possible explanation occurred to you?" "No," I answered frankly, "and I've tried mighty hard to find another." "Let's go back a bit. The discovery, whatever it was made at the last moment." "Yes, at the moment she left the decorator and started upstairs to get her veil." "Was it made accidentally?" "I don't know." "But I do. It was not accidentally, it was by design. Things don't happen accidentally just in the nick of time." "No," I agreed, "they don't." "It was his revenge," continued Godfrey with growing excitement. "He wanted to get even, and he waited till the last moment. It was certainly artistic." "If he really wanted to crush her," I suggested, my lips trembling with the horror of the thought, "he'd have waited a little longer." Godfrey stared at me with glittering eyes. "You're right," he agreed after a moment. "He didn't want to get even then. He wanted her back. So he sent a letter." "It wasn't a letter. Perhaps it was a telegram." "No, it wasn't a telegram. I looked that up. Are you sure it wasn't a letter?" "Yes. The morning mail was delivered shortly after 9. She was happy as usual until the moment of her disappearance 2 hours later. If it wasn't a letter or a telegram, he must have come in person." Godfrey sat for a moment with intent face. "I hardly think so," he said at last. "Some one would have noticed a stranger, and I made special inquiries on that point, though it was a lover I was looking for, not a husband. I rather imagined that there was another man in the case, and that, at the last moment, she decided to marry him and run away to do it." No, I said decidedly. She was in love with Curtis, passionately in love with him. Well, lover or husband, I don't believe he came in person. I think it much more probable that the warning came from inside the house. From the maid, I suggested. Precisely, he nodded. From the maid. Then suddenly I recalled the sweet face, the clear gaze. "It's a pretty theory, Godfrey," I said, "but I don't believe it. Have you ever seen Miss Lawrence?" "No, not even her photograph. I tried to get one and failed," he added, with rueful countenance. "She's a beautiful woman. She's more than that. She's a good woman. There's something Madonna-like about her." "Most of the famous Madonnas," he said, smiling, "however virginal in appearance, were anything but Madonna-like in behaviour. Andrea del Sarto's, for instance." With a little shiver I remembered Mr. Royce's phrase. It was to the Del Sarto Madonna he had compared her. Could I be wrong in my estimate of her, after all? "There's no other theory will explain her flight," he repeated, "presuming, of course, that she was sane." "She was very sane," I said in a low voice. "She was a self-controlled, well-balanced woman." "And that she still loves Curtis." "I'm sure she does." "Then you'll find I'm right. But come," he added, rising, "I've got some work to do. I'll try to meet you as you come away from the Kingdon cottage. I'm curious to know what luck you'll have." He left me at the hotel door and hurried away toward the business part of town, while I turned in the opposite direction. Godfrey's confidence in his theory weighed upon me heavily. He was right in saying that it seemed the only tenable one, and yet, with the memory of Miss Lawrence's pure face before me, I could not believe it. I could not believe that those clear eyes sheltered such a secret. I could not believe that anything shameful had ever touched her. She had kept herself unspotted from the world, and I would prove it. As I reached the Kingdon house and turned in at the gate, I remembered with a smile the resolution I had made the night before to buy a revolver. It seemed absurd enough in the light of the clear day that I should arm myself against two women. There was a flower bed on either side of the walk, well kept and in a riot of bloom, and along the hedges and about the house were others. Evidently the women who lived here not only loved flowers, but had ample time to tend them. As I approached the house I saw that the blinds were drawn, and there seemed no sign of life about the place, but the door was opened almost instantly in answer to my knock. The woman who opened it I knew at once for the elder Miss Kingdon, and my eyes were caught and my attention held by the bold, virile beauty of her face, a beauty which had, in a way, burnt itself out by its very fierceness. She resembled her sister, and yet there was something higher and finer about her. She gave me the impression of one who had passed through a fiery furnace, and not unscathed. I wondered, as Godfrey had, at the dark splendour of her eyes. I could fancy how they would burn and sparkle once she was roused to anger. "This is Miss Kingdon?" I asked. She bowed. "I'm going to ask a favour, Miss Kingdon," I said, "the favour of a few moments' conversation." "Are you a reporter?" she demanded, without seeking to soften the harshness of the question. And in an instant I knew that it was she who had threatened me through the door the night before, for the voice was the same and yet not the same. Then it had been edged and broken by a kind of frenzy. Now it was almost domineering in its cool insolence. What was it had so shaken her? Fear at my knock at that hour of the night? Yet she seemed anything but a woman easily alarmed. "No, I'm not a reporter," I answered, smiling as well as I could to hide the tumult of my thoughts. "My name is Lester, and I'm acting for Mr. Curtis. I hope you'll grant my request." She looked at me more closely, and her lips curved derisively. "I've heard of you," she said. "From your sister, no doubt. I had the pleasure of meeting her yesterday afternoon." I could not wholly keep the irony out of my tone. "I guess you didn't find out much from her," she retorted. "Not half as much as she knew. I hope you'll be more frank with me." She hesitated a moment longer, then stood aside. "Very well, come in," she said, and as I entered she pointed the way into a room at the right. It was a large, pleasant room, well furnished and in excellent taste. On my first glance around, my eyes were caught and held by a portrait which occupied the place of honor on the wall opposite the front windows. It was a woman's head, life size, evidently done from life, crude enough in execution, but of a woman so brilliantly beautiful that her face seemed to glow through the canvas, to rise superior to the lack of skill with which the artist had depicted her. There was something familiar about it, too, at least I fancied so, and then I shook the thought away impatiently. "Well?" asked a voice, and I turned to see that Miss Kingdon was waiting for me to speak. "Sit down," she added abruptly, and herself sat down opposite me, and gazed at me with fierce eyes that never wavered. "Mr. Curtiss is naturally anxious," I began, "to find Miss Lawrence and to hear from her own lips the reason for her flight. He even thinks he has a certain right to know that reason. I'm trying to find where Miss Lawrence is." "And why do you come here?" she asked, with compressed lips. "Because," I answered boldly, "I believe that Miss Lawrence came here after she left her home. She went first into the library, where she sat for a while until she decided what to do. Then she opened the library window, descended from the balcony, and ran here along the path which leads through the trees to that gate out yonder. You received her and refused to allow any one to see her." "I refused to allow the reporters to see her," she cried. "Surely you would have done as much." "Yes," I said, repressing as well as I could the sudden burst of triumph which glowed within me. "Yes, perhaps I should. But you'll not refuse me." She smiled grimly. "That was cleverly done, Mr. Lester," she said. "Fortunately, it's no longer a question of my consent or refusal." "Miss Lawrence isn't here?" "No, Miss Lawrence left here late last night." "And went—" "Ah, that I shall not tell." I looked at her again and saw that by arguing I should be simply wasting my time. I saw something else, too. This woman also knew the reason for Marcia Lawrence's flight. But she was looking at me with a sudden white intensity. "It was you," she said hoarsely, "who knocked at the door in the middle of the night." "Yes," I admitted, fascinated by her burning gaze, "it was I." "Why did you do that?" "I don't exactly know," I answered lamely, not daring to tell the truth. "I was passing the house and saw a light—" "Where?" she demanded, her face contracting in a quick spasm. "In the window yonder," and I heard her deep breath of relief. "I thought perhaps it was Miss Lawrence." "It was I," she said, and I saw she was visibly forcing herself to go on. "I had been putting away some fruit in the cellar. Your knock at that hour startled me." "Quite naturally," I assented. "I wonder at myself now for knocking." "How did you happen to be passing the house at that time?" she asked suddenly. "I'd been awakened by a bad dream and found I couldn't go to sleep again, so decided to walk a little. I walked in this direction, I suppose, because I was thinking about Miss Lawrence." She was looking at me keenly, but saw that I spoke the truth, and again gave a quick sigh of relief. "Miss Lawrence was not here then?" I questioned, deciding to become the inquisitor in my turn. "Oh, no, she left several hours earlier. I was alone in the house, which rendered your knock all the more disquieting. My sister remained with Mrs. Lawrence last night." And she rose to indicate that my audience was at an end. I rose somewhat reluctantly. I felt that she could tell me so much more if she would. It was provoking to be so near success and yet not to succeed. "I'm sorry," I said, "that you refuse to tell me where Miss Lawrence has gone. I don't believe you're acting wisely, nor is she in running away. She should be brave enough to stay and face Mr. Curtiss. He has a right—" "There are others who have rights," she cried, her self control suddenly deserting her. "There are others who have waived their rights and torn their hearts and withered in silence." She stopped abruptly, and I saw the tremor which swept through her as she controlled herself. "That is all," she said more calmly, but with working face. "Your parrot-like talk of Mr. Curtiss's rights provoked me," and she moved toward the door. I paused for a last glance at the portrait, and again I was struck by its likeness to some one I knew. "That is a most remarkable picture," I said. "The person who painted it seems to have been clumsy enough, and yet there is something vital and bewitching about it." There was a signature scrawled in one corner, and I bent closer to decipher it. "It was painted by a cousin of mine," said Miss Kingdon indifferently. And suddenly the scrawl became intelligible. "Ruth Endicott," I read, with a quick glow of interest. "What do you know of her?" she demanded, looking at me sharply. "Nothing," I answered as indifferently as I could. "Only I should be interested to know how she developed. She seems to have had great talent." "That was the last picture she ever painted," said Miss Kingdon shortly. Then her eyes flamed suddenly and her face darkened as she stepped close to the portrait and stared at it. "She was beautiful, beautiful," she murmured hoarsely. And I knew that Ruth Endicott's last painting had been a portrait of herself. And yet it was scarcely a portrait either, for the features were barely indicated. But gazing at it, one saw a woman there, a woman real and vital, and knew instinctively that she was beautiful. It was what I suppose would be called an impressionistic picture, but it differed from most impressionistic pictures in showing imagination in the artist instead of demanding it from the observer. But why should that pictured face seem so familiar? Not in lineament, but in poise and expression, it recalled some one vividly. There was no doubting the resemblance, but grope in my memory as I might, I could not place it. "When you are quite ready," said Miss Kingdon, in a voice quivering with impatience, "I shall be glad to show you out." I turned to find her glaring at me almost like a beast at bay. With an imperious gesture, which checked on my lips any questions I would have asked, she led the way out into the hall. "You are at liberty to search the house," she said coldly, intercepting the glance I shot about me, "if you doubt my statement that Miss Lawrence is no longer here." The thought flashed through my mind that I would welcome a chance to take a look into the cellar and inspect the fruit which it had taken hours to arrange, but I did not dare suggest it. "No," I protested, "I believe you," and in another moment I was in the street. Godfrey was awaiting me. "Well?" he asked. "Not there," I said. "But she was there." "Yes, it was there she took refuge, you were right about that. But she left late last night. I don't know how or where. Miss Kingdon refused to tell me." He pondered this an instant with half closed eyes. "I don't think she can slip through our fingers," he said at last. "Every one about here knows her." "If she took the train," I suggested, "the agent may remember." "Yes," he agreed. "And by the way," he added suddenly, "it was a letter which caused all this trouble." "A letter?" "Yes, a special delivery letter. It was delivered at 11:15 o'clock yesterday morning. The boy mounted the steps and was going to ring the bell when Miss Lawrence herself, who was just starting up the stairs, saw him and came to the door, which was open, and took the letter. It was addressed to her, and she signed for it." "Where was it from?" I asked. "It was from New York, and across the front, in a bold hand, was written, 'Important. Read at once.'" End of chapter 11. Chapters 12 and 13 of That Affair at Elizabeth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That Affair at Elizabeth by Burton E. Stevenson. Chapter 12. Word from the Fugitive. I glanced at my watch. It wanted still half an hour of 11 o'clock. "Let's walk on together," I said. "This needs talking over. A special delivery letter from New York, then, causes Marcia Lawrence, a well-poised, self-possessed, happy woman, to flee from the man she loves, to wreck her life, throw away her future." I stopped in despair. Really, I felt for the moment like tearing my hair. "It seems incredible, doesn't it?" asked Godfrey, smiling at my bewildered countenance. "Incredible? Why, it's more than that. It's I don't know any words strong enough to describe it. Godfrey, what is this secret?" "I know what it isn't." "Well, what isn't it, then?" "It isn't about Curtiss. We've looked into his life I just got a report from Delaney and he's as straight as a string." "And the women?" "With the women it isn't so easy. You see, they were in Europe for 6 or 7 years, and it's hard to follow them. However, we're on their track, and I have hopes." "Hopes?" "Of proving my theory the right one. Depend upon it, Lester, there's either a lover or a husband in the background somewhere." But again I remembered the photograph. "A lover, perhaps," I admitted, "but not a husband, Godfrey. There's no stain like that on her there's no stain at all. She's spotless, I'll stake my soul upon it." He was gazing at me curiously. "You seem mighty certain about it," he commented. For an instant I had an impulse to show him the photograph, but I stifled it. "I am certain," I answered lamely. "Certain your theory's all wrong." "Well, I'm going to stick to it till I find a better one." "Are you going to make it public?" "No, not till we've got something more to back it. We've wired our European correspondents to look up the record of the women while they were abroad. We'll wait till we get reports from them, which will be tomorrow or the day after. Let's see if we can find out which way Miss Lawrence went last night." We had reached the hotel, and as he spoke, Godfrey turned into it. "The ticket agent boards here," he said, "and I took care to make friends with him. I thought perhaps he might be able to help me. Ah, there he is now. Wait a moment." He hurried forward and intercepted a well-dressed man who was just leaving the office. I saw them stop for a moment's low-toned conversation. Then Godfrey turned back towards me. "No," he said, "no luck. Miss Lawrence bought no ticket at the station here last night, nor did either of the Kingdons. The agent was on duty from 6 o'clock till midnight, but he suggests a very simple way in which she could have escaped notice, had she wished. She had merely to enter the train without buying a ticket, and pay her fare direct to the conductor. I'm inclined to think that's what she did, providing, of course, that she left town at all." "I think she's left," I said, "and that's no doubt the way she did it." "Now I'll have to say good bye," he added. "I don't think I shall stay here much longer the case isn't worth it. When do you go back?" "I don't know yet," I answered. "I've got to have something to take to Curtiss I can't go back empty handed." "I'll let you know if I hear anything," he said. "Our correspondent here will be on the lookout for developments. My sympathies are all with Curtiss. I want to help you." "Thank you," I said. "Good bye." I watched him for a moment as he hurried down the street. Then I turned back toward the Lawrence house. Yes, Godfrey evidently wished to help me, and yet, while he had given me a lot of what he called interesting information, and had treated me to a no less interesting theory, he had only made the mystery more impenetrable than ever. "Beg pardon, sir," said a voice, and somebody ran into me. I glanced up to see that it was a pert-looking boy wearing a cap with WU on the front. We were just at the Lawrence gate. "All right," I said, "no harm done," and entered. Not till I was halfway up the walk did it occur to me that the boy had probably come out of the gate, that he had brought a message. From whom? For whom? I rang the bell, and a girl admitted me, but it was not Lucy Kingdon, whom I had hoped to see. She showed me into the library and took my card. She must have met her mistress in the hall, for it was only a moment before the rustle of approaching skirts announced her. As she entered, I noticed with a quick leap of the heart that she held crushed in her hand a sheet of yellow paper. "Good morning, Mr. Lester," she said quite composedly, and it was evident that she had entirely conquered the agitation which had racked her the evening before. "Sit down, please," and she herself sank into a chair. "I've been thinking over what you said to me yesterday afternoon," she continued, "and I believe that you were right. Mr. Curtiss unquestionably has the right to know what it is that takes his promised wife away from him, and to decide if he shall permit it to take her away forever." "Then it's not impossible that she should be his wife?" I questioned quickly. "Your daughter was mistaken?" She perhaps thought it impossible at first, but I don't see it so. She has been moved, I should say, by a sense of faithfulness to the dead. I can't think that he will take it so seriously as she does. He will look at it from a man's point of view. He won't shrink from it as she did. Besides, he'll see that it is no fault in her, that she's just as she always was, sweet, pure, and lovable. She herself will take it less seriously when she has time to think it over." "Yes," I agreed, striving to conceal from her the fact that I did not in the least understand. "No doubt of that. The first shock when she read the letter—" "The letter!" she broke in. "Which letter?" "But I thought you knew." "I knew nothing of any letter," she said, her face suddenly white. "Yesterday morning," I said, "just as Miss Lawrence was going upstairs after looking at the decorations, a boy came to the door with a special delivery letter from New York. It was addressed to her, marked 'Important, read at once.' She took it and came into this room, and it was here she learned this secret." But Mrs. Lawrence was no longer listening. She was sitting there staring straight before her, her face livid. "A letter!" she repeated hoarsely. "A letter! I don't understand. I thought she had been told. I thought that woman had told her. I was sure of it. Yes, that must have been it. I cannot be mistaken. The letter had nothing to do with it. It was that woman. She had waited all these years, and then—" There was a step at the door, and Lucy Kingdon's dark face appeared. She was going past, but at the sight of us she hesitated, and then stopped on the threshold. "Did you call, ma'am?" she asked, shooting me at the same time a glance so venomous that I recoiled a little. "No," said Mrs. Lawrence, and it seemed to me that there was abhorrence in the look she turned upon the other woman. "Yet stay," she added quickly. "Go to your sister. Tell her I wish to see her here at once." I saw the girl's start of surprise. She half opened her lips to speak, then glanced at me again and closed them. "Very well, ma'am," she said, and left the room. Mrs. Lawrence turned to me, still breathing quickly under the stress of the emotion which shook her. "You must leave me to solve this mystery, Mr. Lester," she said rapidly, "by myself and in my own way. I must find who it is that has dared to meddle in my family affairs. I was prepared to forgive, but there are some things which can never be forgiven, however deeply one may pity—" She checked herself. Perhaps she saw the intentness of my interest. "But that is no concern of yours," she went on more calmly, and I could not but admit the justice of the rebuke. "You're seeking Marcia. In that I would help you if I could, but I don't know where she is. As soon as I do know, I will summon Mr. Curtiss. I promise you that. Perhaps you will find her without my help. If you do, tell Mr. Curtiss to go to her and demand an explanation. It is due him, and she has my full permission to tell him everything. Then let him decide whether she shall be his wife. We will both bow to his decision." "But you've heard from her?" I persisted. "Only this," she answered, and thrust a crumpled piece of paper into my hand, then turned and left the room. I smoothed it out and read the message at a glance, noting that it was dated from New York. "I am safe. Do not worry. Will write. Marcia." Chapter 13. Pursuit. My work at Elizabeth was done. Whatever mystery this house contained, whatever the secrets of the Kingdons and the Lawrences, my business was not with them. I had only to return to New York and place this message in Burr Curtiss's hands. I would counsel him to wait until Marcia Lawrence chose to reveal herself. I was sure it would not be long. A few days' respite would be wise for both of them. They would be calmer, more self-controlled, better able to meet bravely and sensibly what must be the one crisis of their lives. But a great load was lifted from me. Mrs. Lawrence had assured me that the marriage was not impossible. Loving each other as they did, I knew that nothing short of the impossible could stand between them. So they would win through at last. Cheered by this thought, I left the house and made my way to the hotel. "When's the next train to New York?" I asked. "There's one on the Pennsylvania, sir, in 10 minutes," said the clerk. "Bus just leaving." I ran out and got aboard, and a moment later we were bumping over the uneven pavement. I took a final look up the shady street. It was the last time I should see it. What was going on, I wondered, in that big house among the trees? Had Miss Kingdon answered the imperative summons sent her? Had there already been an explanation, a revelation of the mystery? Had she confessed that it was indeed she who revealed the secret? Was Mrs. Lawrence right in thinking the letter from New York had no connection with it? The bus stopped abruptly, and I clambered down to the platform and got my ticket. It was still some minutes till train time, and while I waited, a train on the Jersey Central track stood puffing a moment and then started on for Philadelphia. The little station was built in the triangle where the two lines crossed. Trains were passing almost every minute, and I reflected how easy it would be for a person not familiar with the place to get confused and to take the wrong train. There came a growing rumble, a shrieking of brakes. A moment more, and we were off. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 12 o'clock. I should be at the office in, say, 45 minutes. I would wire Curtiss at once, and the rest would be in his hands. My connection with the case would end. And yet it was not without a certain regret that I would relinquish it, for I had not solved the mystery. That was, if anything, more impenetrable than when I had first approached it. Godfrey's specious theory, which I had myself at first believed, I put aside, for even from the broken sentences which had fallen from Mrs. Lawrence's lips, I could see that it was not the right one. If Marcia Lawrence had fled in order to protect the memory of the dead, there could be no question of a living husband. But though I rejected that explanation, it was evident that, with the data at hand, I could form no adequate one to replace it. I went over in my mind every phase of the affair from first to last. I endeavored to sift out the significant incidents and to reject the immaterial. I tried to weld them into a compact mass, but they would not be welded. There was nothing to connect them, no common thread upon which they could be strung. All that I had in my possession was a bundle of facts which seemed to be flatly self-contradictory. I remembered Mrs. Lawrence's astonishment when I had mentioned the existence of the letter. What had she said? I thought it was that woman. Which woman? Evidently the elder Kingdon, since she had at once sent for her. That had been my suspicion, that it was she or her sister who had betrayed the secret. Yet the letter would seem to prove that it was someone else. And it struck me as significant that at no time had Mrs. Lawrence appeared to suspect the maid. Was there really any connection, I wondered, between that old tragedy in Mrs. Lawrence's life and this in the life of her daughter? I reviewed again the story Dr. Schuyler had told me, how the lives of the Endicotts and the Kingdons and the Lawrences had intertwined. I got out my notebook and sketched a rough table showing their relationship, which seemed to look somewhat as here shown. As I gazed down at this, two names seemed to stand out more vividly than all the rest. I closed my eyes and called before me the faces of two beautiful women. I had never seen either of them in life. Of one I had only a photograph, of the other I had seen only a crude portrait in the parlor of the Kingdon cottage, but they had somehow assumed for me personalities distinct and vivid. Marcia Lawrence and Ruth Endicott, the tragedy of fate linked them together. Beautiful, young, accomplished, reared amid gentle surroundings, both had tasted the bitterness of life. From the very house whence Marcia Lawrence fled, Ruth Endicott had started on her hopeless search for health. The train slowed up for Jersey City, and in a moment was rolling under the great shed. 20 minutes later I opened our office door. Mr. Royce had gone out for lunch, which reminded me that I had missed mine again, but he came in almost immediately. "Well?" he cried as he crossed the threshold and came forward with expectant face. "You'd better wire Curtiss to come back," I said. "You've news for him?" I nodded. "I knew you'd have," he said exultantly, and drew a pad of telegraph forms toward him and wrote a rapid message. "Curtis is staying at a little place on Jamaica Bay. He was afraid to go any farther away, I suppose. He ought to be here in an hour," he added, and called a boy and gave him the message. Then he swung around to me again. "Now let's have the story," he prompted. "I know there's a story." "Yes," I said, "there's a story. I was just—" The door burst open with a crash, and in came Burr Curtis himself. "I couldn't stay away any longer," he cried. "I was eating my heart out. Have you any news?" "Sit down, Curtis, and pull yourself together," interposed our junior, catching him by the arm. "This won't do. I just wired you to come on. You must have met the boy." "I believe I did knock over a youngster just outside the door." "Well, there's no damage done, I guess. Since you're here, Lester can go right ahead with the story." "But one thing first," interrupted our client. "Did you find out where she went, Mr. Lester?" "No," I answered, "but I have a message from her." "Thank God!" he murmured, and sank back in his chair. I guessed what his fear had been, that Marcia Lawrence was no longer among the living. Looking at him closely, I was shocked at the change a single day had wrought in him. His eyes were bloodshot from want of sleep, his face pale and drawn, his hair and beard unkempt. In a word, he had ceased to be the handsome, well-groomed man the world knew as Burr Curtis. I related my doings briefly, including only the essential points. Then I placed the message in his hands. He read it, his face quivering. "But this tells us nothing," he said hoarsely, looking up at me with piteous eyes. "Except that she was in New York this morning, and wants to fight her battle out by herself." Curtis was on his feet, his face livid. "But she shan't fight it out by herself!" he cried. "Do you think I'm such a coward as that, to stand back, not offering to help?" "Perhaps you can't help," I interposed. "Don't talk nonsense," he retorted. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Lester, but I'm overwrought. I can't choose my words. But it is nonsense. I love her. Of course I can help. Don't you see it's not herself she's thinking of? She's trying to spare me." I nodded. Perhaps it was for his sake that Marcia Lawrence had taken that wild step. That would be like a woman. "You may be right," I said. "I'd never thought of that solution. But Mrs. Lawrence's last words to me would seem to point that way. She said that the matter would rest in your hands, that it would be for you to choose after you'd heard the story." "I don't want to hear the story!" Curtis cried. "Good God, what do I care for the story? I've made my choice, once and forever. I want her. Of course it was to spare me she ran away. She'd never think of herself." I might have retorted that it had been a rather questionable form of mercy, that she could scarcely have inflicted on him any suffering more acute than that which she had undergone. But I forbore. Instead, I took the telegram again and studied it. "If you really wish to find her," I said, "perhaps this will give us a clue." "I do wish to find her. This form will tell us which station this message was sent from, I think. Wait here a minute," and I crossed the hall to the brokerage offices of Sims and Wesson. "May I speak to your operator?" I asked of the junior partner. "Certainly," he said, and waved me to the little room where the instruments were clicking merrily away. "Can you tell me what these characters mean?" I asked, placing the message before the operator and pointing to the row of figures and letters at the top of it. 61 CWDD SA 8 PD. "The 61," he said, "means that this was the 61st message received at Elizabeth this morning. CW means that the message was filed at the Christopher Street office, corner Christopher and West. DD and SA are the initials of the operators who sent and received the message. 8PD means that there are 8 words in the message and that it was prepaid. It's the regular form used on all Western Union messages." "Thank you," I said, and hurried back across the hall elated, for I had learned more than I had dared to hope. "Well?" asked Curtis, looking up with anxious face. "The message was filed at the Christopher Street office," I said. "Christopher and West Streets." "West Street?" echoed Mr. Royce. "What on earth was she doing there?" "She could have been doing only one thing," I pointed out exultantly. "When a woman goes down to the docks, it must be to take a boat." "Just so. And when she goes to that particular portion of the docks, it must be to take a transatlantic liner." Curtis stared at me for a moment as though not understanding. Then he rose heavily to his feet. "Well, I can follow her even there," he said, and started for the door. But Mr. Royce had him by the arm. "My dear Curtis," he protested, "think what a wild goose chase you're starting on." "Better than sitting idle here," retorted Curtis doggedly, and I could not but agree with him. "Perhaps we can narrow the search down a little," I said. "Suppose we drive around to the West Street office." "Just what I was about to do," said Curtis, and led the way to the elevator. During that drive across town we found little to say. Curtis was deep in his own thoughts, and I saw from the way Mr. Royce looked at him how anxious he was concerning him. But at last we reached our destination. "Can you give me any description of the person who sent this message?" I asked, and spread out the telegram before the man at the desk. "Perhaps you'll let us see the original." He glanced at the message and then at us. "No question of a mistake, I hope," he said. "The message reads straight enough." "No," I answered. "Rather a question of preventing a mistake. I hope you won't refuse us." He glanced us over again and seemed to understand. "It's a little irregular," he said, "but I guess I can do it." He opened a drawer and ran through a sheaf of papers. "Here it is," he said, and laid a sheet before us. "You see the message was correctly sent." "Yes," I agreed, "but it was not at the message I was looking. It was at the sheet upon which it was written, a sheet which had embossed at the top the words SS Umbria." "Who sent the message?" I asked. "It was brought in by a messenger from the Cunard Line pier." "What time did the Umbria sail?" "She was to have sailed at 12 o'clock, but was delayed by a little accident of some sort. Perhaps she's still at her pier." I thanked fortune that I had told our cabman to wait. I think Curtis would have been crazed by any delay. As it was, we rushed from the office and crowded in. "The Cunard pier!" cried Mr. Royce, "and in a hurry!" and he waved a bill under the cabman's nose. Not until we were under way did Curtis speak. "Did you see?" he asked, in a voice which shook convulsively. "The message was in Marcia's writing." "Yes," I said. "I recognized it." "We must catch the boat. Why don't that fellow whip up?" "He's going as fast as he can," said Mr. Royce. "Sit still, Curtis," and he threw an arm about him. What a ride that was over the cobblestones! Half a dozen times I thought a collision inevitable, but we had fallen into skilful hands, and were safely piloted through openings in the crowd of vehicles where it seemed a hand-barrow could not hope to go. "Here we are!" cried cabby, and we tumbled out. He had done his best to earn his tip, and got it. The pier was crowded, but we forced our way along it with scant regard for the feelings of other people. Had the ship sailed? Were we in time? "She's gone," said Mr. Royce, as we gained the front of the crowd. "See there?" There she was, headed squarely down the stream, just gathering speed. There was a flutter of handkerchiefs from her deck. We could see the people crowding against the rail in their eagerness to wave a last good bye. Curtis, who had been staring at her stupidly, suddenly flushed and pulled himself erect. "There she is!" he cried. "See, standing alone by that forward boat." I stared with all my eyes. There was indeed a figure there, a woman clad in black, but the face was the merest blur. "You think so?" I asked incredulously. "I know so," and he swung sharp around, his face alight with eagerness. "Come, there must be some way to catch her a tug." He accosted the first blue-coated official he could find, but that worthy shook his head. No tug could catch the Umbria now; besides, there was none at hand to make the trial. By the time one could be secured, the ship would be far down the bay, settling into her speed. What was the trouble? A lady on board? "Well, the best you can do is meet her at Liverpool when she lands," he said. "Meet her?" echoed Curtis. "But how?" "Take the Oceanic. She'll sail in half an hour from Pier 48, just below here. She'll reach Liverpool ahead of the Umbria, perhaps a day ahead." I saw Curtis's lips tighten with sudden resolution. "Thank you," he said. "I'll do it." There was nothing to be said. He was past arguing with, even had we felt like arguing, which I, for one, did not. "I'll cable," he promised, as we stood in the shadow of the big liner, "and let you know if I find her." "Have you money enough?" asked Mr. Royce. "Don't hesitate to say so if you haven't." Curtis laughed bitterly. "Oh, I've enough," he said. "Quite a roll, in fact. I'd expected to spend it on a honeymoon." "You'll have the honeymoon yet," said Mr. Royce, with a certainty I thought a little forced. "What will you do for clothes?" "I can make out some way till I get to the other side. The steward can help me." Mr. Royce was again looking at him anxiously. "I don't like it," he said, "your running off this way. You'll kill yourself." "Oh, I'll be all right," Curtis assured him. "A sea voyage is just what would have been prescribed for me." And he attempted a smile. "But you've got the worst stateroom on board," and indeed the Oceanic had been so crowded that he was fortunate to get that. "No matter," said Curtis. "I'd have gone if there'd been no place but the steerage." "There's one thing," I said. "Have you an enemy in New York who might try to do you an injury? That would explain the letter, you know." Curtis thought for a moment with knitted brows. Then he shook his head. "No," he said decidedly. "I've no enemy, certainly none who would descend to stabbing me in the back. Besides, what could even the most unscrupulous enemy have written? How could he have hurt me? I can't understand it," he added wearily. "Neither can I agreed. "It's beyond reasoning about." "An enemy might have written a lie," suggested Mr. Royce. "But Marcia wouldn't have believed it," retorted Curtis. "I know her. She would have cast it from her. She trusted me. No, whatever the secret, it was one whose truth she could not doubt." And I agreed with him. We shook hands with him at last, and when the great White Star ship swung out into the stream, he waved us a final good bye from the deck. "So he's gone," I said, as we rolled back downtown again. "Yes, and the question is whether he was wise to go, whether it can do any good." "I think he's wise," I said. "It's a real passion, as you yourself pointed out to me." "A real passion, yes," agreed our junior. "And yet, do you know, Lester, at the bottom of it all I suspect some hideous, unbelievable thing. It turns me cold sometimes, trying to imagine what the secret is. It's a sort of dim, vague, threatening monster. Yes, I've felt that way about it. I can't grasp it, and yet I feel that it's there, just below the surface of things, ready to jump out and rend us. Well, Curtis will find out." "I hope so, if only for his sake. He'll go mad if he doesn't, and so will we if we talk about it any more. I want you to look over those papers in the Consolidated suit. It comes up this afternoon, you know, and by Jove, we'll have to hurry or we'll be late for the hearing." End of chapter 13. Chapters 14 and 15 of That Affair at Elizabeth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. That Affair at Elizabeth by Burton E. Stevenson. Chapter 14. Recalled to the Front. Never were slippers and easy chair more welcome to me than they were that night. I was thoroughly weary in mind as well as body, and as I dropped into the chair and donned the slippers, I determined to go early to bed, and to forget all about the Lawrence enigma. I was heartily glad that I was rid of it. It had proved so baffling, so discouraging, that I rejoiced at the chance which had taken it out of my hands. Burr Curtis must puzzle it out for himself. I fancied I could see him pacing up and down the deck of the Oceanic, staring ahead into the starlit night, bracing himself for that meeting which would mean so much to him. I wondered what Marcia Lawrence's thoughts were. Did she regret that she had fled? Did she already see the fatal error of that step? Ah, if her lover were only beside her there on the deck, as he might have been but for that cruel irony of fate which had swept her from him! She could not know that he was pursuing her, that he would be the first to meet her as she stepped ashore at Liverpool. How would she bear the shock of that meeting? I had bought a copy of the last edition of the Record as I came up from dinner, and I shook it out and glanced over it. Apparently Godfrey had discovered nothing new in the affair at Elizabeth, for the paper made absolutely no reference to it, so far as I could discover. No doubt he had returned to New York immediately after bidding me good bye. By this time he was probably deep in the untangling of some other mystery for the benefit of the Record's readers. Sensations of today eclipsed those of yesterday, and I realized how quickly Burr Curtis and his affairs would drop from the public mind. But as I laid the paper aside and filled my pipe for a final smoke before turning in, I told myself that I could scarcely hope that they would drop so easily from my mind, however much I might wish it. Besides, I had left it unsolved and seemingly unsolvable, and a mystery of that sort is not easily forgotten. It is like an unfinished book, an unsettled case. It lives to oppress the mind and pique the imagination. I knocked out my pipe impatiently. The place for me was in bed. I was becoming obsessed by this affair. If I did not shake it off, it would end by getting such a grip of me that I could not sleep at all, or I would fall asleep only to be startled awake again as I had been the night before. That was a truly terrifying prospect. I started for my bedroom, when a tap at my door stopped me. I opened it to find Mrs. Fitch, my landlady, on the threshold. "A telegram for you, Mr. Lester," she said, and held it out to me. I told the boy to wait. "Thank you," I said, and tore open the envelope. "There'll be no answer," I added, a moment later, and shut the door somewhat hastily, I fear. But Mrs. Fitch's eyes are sharp ones, and I did not wish her to see my face just then. I dropped into my chair and read the message again. "I advise you to return to Elizabeth at once. New developments in which you will be interested. Godfrey." New developments? Ah, Godfrey knew me well, for already my fatigue was forgotten in the ardor of the chase, and a moment later I found myself changing from slippers to shoes as fast as my fingers could handle the laces. Mrs. Fitch met me on the stair. "Not going out again, Mr. Lester," she protested. "Why, you'll kill yourself." "I can't help it, Mrs. Fitch," I said. "I've got to go." "Not bad news, I hope?" "No." "And you'll be back soon?" "Not to night, I'm afraid." "Oh, nonsense, Mr. Lester." But I left her protesting on the step and hurried down the street. Mrs. Fitch meant well, but she was sometimes a little in the way. I took the elevated to Cortlandt Street and hurried down to the ferry, expecting every instant to hear the gong which announced the departure of the boat. But I found that I had 10 minutes to wait before there was a train, and I spent them walking feverishly up and down the narrow waiting room, where the road's patrons are herded like cattle behind the slatted gates. At last the gates opened. There was the usual rush to the boat, the slow crossing of the wide river with the cool salt breeze coming in from the ocean, the stampede to the coaches through the great Jersey City station, and finally I found myself in a seat, with the train rumbling out from under the long shed. I stared out into the night, wondering what the new developments could be. They must have been unusual and unexpected ones to stir Godfrey to sending me that telegram. But what could they be? For the present the case was closed. Curtis and Miss Lawrence were both in mid-ocean, and any further developments must await their meeting. Besides, it was only a few hours since I myself had left Elizabeth, and there had seemed no prospect then of anything further happening there. Godfrey had announced his own intention of leaving the place at once. He had said that the case wasn't worth wasting any more time over. What, then, had detained him? Was it possible, I asked myself, that Marcia Lawrence had not sailed on the Umbria? That the message had been merely a blind? That she had foreseen that we would trace it to the West Street office? That she had written it on a sheet of the steamer's paper for the purpose of deceiving us? Yes, that was clearly possible. She may have returned home, and Godfrey, discovering the return, had summoned me to be present at her unmasking. I had really only half believed that it was she whom Curtis had descried upon the Umbria's forward deck, but if she had indeed done all this, she must be far more deeply versed in deception than I had supposed. I should hardly have given her credit for laying a plan so adroit as that, but one can never judge a woman's capabilities. Suddenly conscious again of my fatigue, I laid my head back against the seat and dozed away until the sharp call of the brakeman aroused me. Not until I had left the train did I remember that Godfrey had appointed no rendezvous. He might perhaps be awaiting me at the hotel, or at least he had certainly left a message there for me, and I started up the street. But an inquiry of the clerk developed the fact that, while Godfrey was still stopping there, he had gone out immediately after dinner, and had left no message of any kind. For a moment I was fairly taken aback, so confident had I been, but perhaps Godfrey had deemed a message superfluous after the hint given in the telegram. I knew how he detested the obvious. He had no doubt thought that hint sufficient, and it was. 11 o'clock was striking as I gained the street again and turned my steps toward the Lawrence place. If there were indeed any new developments, it must be either there or at the cottage that they had come to light. That was self-evident. That could be the only rendezvous. It was there Godfrey was awaiting me. So I walked on rapidly, and in a very few minutes reached my destination. The house was dark and gloomy as it had been the night before. I entered the grounds and made a careful circuit of the place, but not a glimmer of light could I detect at any of the windows. There was nothing to indicate that any one was stirring, nor did I come upon any trace of Godfrey, though I half expected to collide with him at any moment. Plainly there was nothing to be discovered here, and at last I turned my steps toward the path which led to the cottage. Then suddenly I stopped, for it seemed to me that I had caught sight of a dim figure flitting among the trees. I was facing the street, and the glow from the arc lights there made a gray background against which I fancied I saw a shadow moving. I strained my eyes. Yes, there it was again, approaching the house along the path. I am no more superstitious than most men, yet for an instant the notion seized me like an electric shock that this was no earthly visitant. But I shook myself together and leaned forward, watching it from behind a sheltering tree. It went directly to the balcony steps and mounted them with a swiftness which showed how familiar it was with the place. Had I been right in my conjecture, then? Had Marcia Lawrence really come home again? The question flashed through my brain like lightning. I had already delayed too much. It was time that I did something. In an instant I had gained the path and mounted the steps. One of the windows was open. I passed through it into the library. There was a sharp click, and in the sudden flare of light I found myself looking down the barrel of a revolver, behind which glared the sinister face of Lucy Kingdon. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. A Battle of Wits. I saw the swift spasm of hatred which crossed her face as she recognized me. I even fancied that her finger tightened convulsively upon the trigger, and I braced myself for the shock. But she did not fire. Instead, she lowered her pistol with a grim little laugh. "So it's you," she said, and stood looking at me, her lips curving maliciously. "Yes," I answered. "Who did you think it was?" "Oh, I don't know. A burglar, perhaps." "You seem to have been prepared for him." "I always carry this pistol when I go back and forth through the grounds at night." "And know how to use it, I dare say." "I think I'd be able to defend myself." "I'm sure of it. Do you often go back and forth at night?" "It's sometimes late when I get through here." "But this time," I pointed out, "you weren't leaving the house, you were returning to it." "Is that any of your business?" she asked, her eyes beginning to gleam. "Perhaps not," I admitted. "And yet you're capable of making a mystery out of it," she sneered. "Let me relieve your mind. I'm staying with Mrs. Lawrence. She sleeps badly and wishes me near her." "And your exits and entrances are, I suppose, usually by the window?" "It's the most convenient way." "Mrs. Lawrence doesn't object, then, to your leaving it open?" "I don't leave it open." "You did just now." She looked at me a moment without replying, then laughed a short little laugh of mingled amusement and vexation. "I'll leave you to puzzle that out, I think," she said. "You're so ingenious, you'll surely hit upon the explanation. I scarcely expected to see you here again," she added. "You thought it worth while to return?" "Yes, there are one or two points which are not quite clear." "And you expect to make them so?" she asked, with a mocking smile. "How? By lurking around the house like a thief, and following women?" There was something in her tone, her look, her attitude, which caught my attention a sort of confident triumph, as of one who plays for a high stake and wins. She was no longer anxious and perturbed as she had been the day before nay, that very morning. She thought it safe to flout me openly. "So you convinced Mrs. Lawrence that you and your sister were not guilty?" I asked. "But of course you'd do that." "Guilty of what?" she demanded, flushing darkly. "Guilty of causing Miss Lawrence's flight," I answered bluntly, "of wrecking her life." "Do you believe that?" "I know it." She laughed scornfully. "You know a great deal, it seems." "More than you think," I retorted. She flushed again and bit her lips to restrain their trembling. "Though there's one thing I don't know," I went on, determined to strike home if I could. "I can't imagine why Miss Lawrence should have chosen your house as a place of refuge. She must know that you hate her, that you waited like a snake in ambush for the moment when the blow would pierce most deeply. She must see that you are using her to avenge yourself." A sharp click interrupted me, and I found myself in darkness. I heard the closing of a door, the turning of a lock. When, after a moment's groping along the wall, I found the electric button and switched on the light again, I saw that the door leading from the library to the hall was closed. I tried it. It was locked. "Good night, Mr. Lester," called a low, mocking voice from the other side. "Please turn off the light before you go, and close the window after you. Another thing, I'd advise you not to disturb my sister again to night. It would really not be safe. And I hope you'll let me know when you succeed in clearing up those little points you were speaking of. I'm immensely interested in them." She laughed again, and I heard her footsteps die away down the hall. Feeling absurdly foolish, I switched off the light and left the house. Plainly, Lucy Kingdon had ceased to fear me. She believed that she had won the fight, that her position was impregnable. Either she thought that Marcia Lawrence had escaped, that we had not traced her to the Umbria, or she knew that the telegram was a blind, and that we had been misled by it. Which was right, I wondered? And she must have come off well, too, in that interview with Mrs. Lawrence, which I would have given so much to have overheard; must have convinced her of her innocence, else she would not still be employed as a maid in the Lawrence house, and retained so near her mistress. How had she done it? How had she succeeded in blinding her mistress so completely? Then a sudden thought stabbed through me. Was it possible, I asked myself, that Mrs. Lawrence had been a party to the deception, that she had knowingly assisted in the farce of the telegram for my benefit? But as I reviewed her behavior at our morning interview, I could not believe it. She was no such consummate actress as that would imply. If I was a dupe, then she was a dupe also. Busy with this problem, I made my way through the grove along the path back to the Kingdon cottage, and stood for a moment looking over the hedge before opening the gate. There was a light in the room which I took to be the dining room, but even as I gazed at it, the light moved, a shadow crossed the blind. The light reappeared in the kitchen, faded, and disappeared. Then, a moment later, my heart leaped suffocatingly as I perceived a glimmer of light at the ventilator in the foundation. What was this woman doing in the cellar? What was the task that was going forward there? I entered the grounds and started forward along the hedge, when suddenly a hand reached up from the shadow and held me fast. For an instant I struggled fiercely to free myself, but only for an instant. "Come, Lester, sit down," said a voice carefully repressed, but which I nevertheless recognized as Godfrey's. I was looking for you," he added, as I dropped to the grass beside him. "Oh, is it you, Godfrey?" I asked, much relieved. "I rather thought you might be out this way when I found you weren't at the hotel. What are the developments?" "Wait a minute. I wonder where that light has gone." "It's in the cellar," I said, and pointed out to him the faint glimmer which marked the ventilator. "It was there last night. I sat here for over an hour and watched it," and I told him briefly of my adventures of the night before. He listened without comment until I had finished. "It's a pity you didn't tell me that this morning," he said. "I didn't see that it was connected with the case in any way. Is it?" "I don't know," he answered shortly. "Perhaps it is. Did Miss Kingdon mention it when she saw you this morning?" "Yes. She said she'd been in the cellar putting away some fruit." "Absurd. There's no fruit this early in the year. Besides, even if it were true, she wouldn't have to repeat the process again to night. What else haven't you told me?" I laughed and recounted my adventures from the moment Mrs. Lawrence gave me her daughter's telegram until that other moment when Lucy Kingdon left me alone in the darkened library. He listened without interruption, his eyes on the glimmer of light at the ventilator. "Yes," he said, "I saw Lucy Kingdon leave the house a few minutes ago. Her sister's alone there now. What do you suppose she's doing in the cellar?" "I can't imagine." "You could see nothing?" "Not a thing except her shadow moving back and forth." "Moving back and forth?" "Yes, it seemed to me that she was alternately rising and stooping, as though she were going through some sort of exercise." "She'd hardly go into the cellar at midnight to exercise." "No, of course not. But that's the only explanation I could think of, unless she's bowing up and down before an idol." Godfrey laughed grimly. "That would be a unique solution," he said. "Fancy our headlines: 'Devil Worship at Elizabeth. Fantastic Midnight Orgies in a Cellar.' Wouldn't that stir the public? But I'm afraid it's a little too fantastic. Could you hear anything?" "Only the faintest of faint sounds. I couldn't make anything of them." "Well, there wouldn't be any sounds at all if she were merely bobbing up and down before an idol. Was she alone last night?" "Yes. Her sister spent the night with Mrs. Lawrence. Godfrey," I added, "you haven't told me yet why you sent that telegram. Has Miss Lawrence returned?" "Not that I know of. Furthermore, I don't think she will return very soon." "Then you think she really sailed?" "I don't know what to think, Lester. Give me a moment more. Isn't there a window to the cellar?" "Yes, but it's closely curtained." "Well, I'm going to take a look myself," he said. "Wait here for me, and be as patient as you can." I saw him go cautiously forward toward the ventilator and stoop down before it. He remained there motionless for some moments, then disappeared around a corner of the house. I sat there waiting for him, thinking, not without some chagrin, that as usual he had pumped me dry and given nothing in return. It was really unfair of Godfrey to expect every one to play into his hands. And yet, I reflected, if he hadn't wanted to be friendly, he would scarcely have taken the trouble to send me that message. I looked up to see his tall figure coming toward me through the darkness. He dropped beside me and sat for a moment silent, only as I caught a glimpse of his face I was startled to see how white it was. "I couldn't see a thing," he said at last, "except a shadow moving up and down, as you said. And I heard the sounds. The woman is working at something in the cellar, something that requires time, something which must be done secretly. I couldn't make anything out of the shadows, and not much out of the sounds. At least, I fear it's only my imagination which gave them the significance they had for me." "What significance did they have?" I asked. "I'm half afraid to tell you, Lester. You'll laugh at me. But as I bent outside that ventilator yonder with my ear against it, I could have sworn that the person inside was engaged in shoveling earth it into a grave." A little shudder ran through me at the words. Never was laughter farther from my thoughts. "A grave!" I stammered. "But whose grave?" "I don't know. Marcia Lawrence's, perhaps." "Marcia Lawrence sailed on the Umbria." "You don't know she did. You don't even believe she did." "Whether she did or not, who would kill her, and why?" "Ah, if you come to the why and wherefore, I can't answer you not yet." "Besides," I went on, "the writing on the message left at the West Street office was her writing." "Perhaps it was only a good imitation. You can't be absolutely sure that you've ever seen a sample of her writing. There's nothing to prove that she wrote either the note or the message." "But Curtiss identified them. He was sure the writing was hers." "Curtiss wasn't in a condition to be sure of anything. But suppose it was hers? She may have wished to blind her mother and Curtiss completely. She may have wished them to think that she had really gone abroad. She must have foreseen that you would trace the telegram. She may have done all that before she came back here." "Came back here," I repeated, suddenly finding a dozen arguments against my own theory of half an hour before. "Walk into the lion's jaws? Nonsense, Godfrey! Place herself in the power of the people who, I suppose you think, killed her?" "I don't think they killed her," Godfrey said composedly. "My belief is that she killed herself to escape her husband, to get out of the tangle in which she'd involved herself." "Her husband? You cling to the husband, then, do you?" "More than ever. He's an Italian, a tall, well built, handsome fellow with black eyes and a most becoming black moustache. He has a florid complexion and can speak English, though with a strong accent. He smokes cigarettes, which he rolls himself, and he has lost the tip of the little finger of his left hand. He's fond of music, perhaps himself a singer or musician, and it may have been as instructor that he first met Miss Lawrence." I had been staring at Godfrey open mouthed. I could restrain myself no longer. "But how do you know all this?" I gasped. "Or is it merely a fairy tale?" "It's not in the least a fairy tale, my dear Lester. I know it because this estimable gentleman was himself in Elizabeth yesterday. The letter which Miss Lawrence received appointed a rendezvous at the Kingdon cottage. It was here she fled to see him, to buy him off, as she had done once before." End of Chapter 15